What's up, everybody? John the Morgile here. Gonna do a flat Earth video for you. Hope you enjoy it. Just wanted to quickly mention I did a live stream yesterday evening. That would have been June the 12th, and of course, right towards the end of it, it was sniped by a troll who thought it would be funny to start playing porn over the live stream, and then, of course, report the live stream as inappropriate, and therefore it was removed by YouTube. I got a community guideline strike, which is currently in appeal stage, and indeed the appeal failed. So this is the level that globetards will go to in order to get our content censored. They'll actually, hack into our live streams and cheat. So that's very scientific, very adult of them, and that's pretty much the only thing they can do to effectively silence flat Earth arguments is to lie and cheat, because logically arguing against flat Earth isn't going to work. We all know that. But just wanted to mention that's why I can, at this point, no longer live stream yet again for another 3 months. So, well done, globetards. In this video, I wanted to go over some basic geometry surrounding flat Earth, because it is pretty simple stuff that wins the day when it comes to scientific examples and proofs, evidences of a flat and motionless Earth. So, some of the most astonishing and simple flat Earth geometry, which really helped me to solidify the flat Earth reality, was very simple stuff when you get right down to it. Now, while I still contend that the Earth's lack of motion is probably the biggest problem for the heliocentric model, because the lack of motion, I believe, can most easily be demonstrated, as opposed to the lack of curvature, which is a little bit more difficult to take in, being as we're so small and tiny compared to the Earth. There are multiple instances of geometry which render observable reality as completely incompatible with the spinning ball Earth theory. We'll go over Polaris, the moon and its phases, the inner solar system, and of course the lack of curvature. Polaris is the North Pole star, as you all know, and it is a critical point which cannot be overlooked by anyone considering the globe Earth theory skeptically for once in their adult life in many cases. We must remember that the globe Earth theory was built largely around astronomical observations. Polaris is arguably among the most important factors in the long series of misunderstandings and biased philosophical decisions which ended in the globe Earth theory in its current, modern form. This is owing to the fact that Polaris, unlike any other star in the world, is clearly and obviously central to all the other stars, at least in the northern so-called hemisphere. A time-lapse view of Polaris will yield animations of a star which doesn't stray much from the bullseye area of the heavens, and all the other stars appear to make circuits around Polaris and concentric with Polaris about once per day. The standard theory purports that while the stars in the night sky may appear to be stationary relative to one another, the stars are supposedly racing at hundreds of thousands of miles per hour, just as our sun is supposedly doing around the Milky Way galaxy. While Polaris is supposedly also a part of the Milky Way galaxy, just as most other visible stars in the night sky allegedly are, the implications of a single star remaining apparently fixed in its position relative to our axis defies common sense geometry, especially when all historical evidence points to Polaris always being exactly where we find it today. And of course, the reason that, or the matrix within which this defies common sense, is of course the infinite space spinning ball Earth theory. There may be rumors of the North Star changing once, like 6,000 years ago, well beyond the scope of any historical records. However, the truth is we should never see a single North Star aligned to our so-called axis of rotation for longer than a few decades at the very most, as the globe-Earth theory has the Earth wobbling on its axis once every 26,000 years or so. In spite of the Earth's hypothetical axial precession, we see the North Star Polaris as a fixture in the heavens throughout all recorded history, which is an absolute deal breaker for the globe theory. Given the unfathomable distance to Polaris alleged by Alliance, its near perfect alignment to astronomical rotation becomes even more peculiar and unlikely by random coincidence, as the further you place Polaris, the more precise its alignment to our axis must be, hypothetically. But if the axis of the Earth is supposed to be in constant realignment due to precession, then how could Polaris have remained precisely aligned to this axis throughout history? The Earth's axis should be constantly changing, albeit ever so slowly, to the tune of about 1 degree every 72 years. Now, while this is certainly not a violent or even readily noticeable change, over the course of a decade or 18 years, let's say, Polaris should be misaligned to its current position a quarter of a degree, describing arc minutes of precession as opposed to degrees in visible space. Since the time of Hipparchus and Ptolemy's discovery of precession of the equinoxes, Polaris should be over 25 full degrees out of line with where our axis was at that time, yet no such changes have ever been documented or observed. In spite of the Earth's supposed tilt from the ecliptic plane, axial rotation and solar system orbit, Polaris remains perfectly aligned to our so-called axis of rotation. To put this in perspective, the degree of accuracy to which our axis is supposedly attuned to Polaris, consider that according to the globe-Earth theory, our axis of rotation is comprised of roughly 8,000 miles straight through the center of the Earth from pole to pole. These 2 points at the north and south poles describe a straight line through the Earth's supposed core, about 8,000 miles long. This straight line is supposedly nearly perfectly aligned to Polaris, some 2.5 quadrillion miles away at all times. While this would be uncanny in a situation where the objects involved are stationary, when you put both the Earth, the Sun, the galaxy, and Polaris in motion around the hypothetical galactic center, such an alignment becomes extremely unlikely. When you couple these assertions of the globe theory with the necessary assertion involving axial rotation and precession, the globe is simply finished hypothetically. According to Lions, everything in the universe was created due to random chance scenarios. And so, according to the Copernican principle, which must be assumed in all globe-Earth hypothesis, there must not be any sort of intelligent design behind creation. It must all be due to random chance, coincidence. And so when you see things like the moon only ever presenting one face to observers on the Earth, the sun and the moon being apparently the same size, although they are allegedly vastly different in size and distance, the fact that our axis supposedly points directly at Polaris for all time, all of these things and many, many more must be due to random chance, or they must come up with some rational explanation to apologize for the globe-Earth theory's unlikeliness and somehow explain away these random chance coincidences as having a rational, non-chaotic or random explanation. So for a couple examples, the sun and the moon are allegedly extremely distant from one another and extremely different in terms of their actual size, although according to an observer on Earth, the apparent angular size of the sun and the moon are approximately identical in most cases, and this is actually not given any sort of logical rational explanation other than it is a mere coincidence. Although when you start figuring up the odds of this happening due to mere coincidence, it becomes really quite unlikely that it, you know, did happen according to coincidence. But for another example, with the same body, or the moon, we only ever see one face of the moon. And in the heliocentric theory, that is very unlikely due to random coincidence, because of course the moon is allegedly orbiting us as we're in motion, and the moon is also allegedly spinning on its axis. And it just so happens that the moon takes exactly, we'll say 28 days to do one orbit around the Earth, in air quotes. The moon also takes that exact same amount of time to do one axial rotation precisely. And so instead of chalking this up to coincidence, which would seem very uncanny, right? They invent the theory of tidal locking, which makes absolutely no sense if you dig into it. But so this is how the Copernican principle is adhered to in theory and apologized for in practice, when it becomes clear that observable reality would be highly unlikely due to random coincidence. And of course, the Copernican principle suggests that all of the universe is homogeneous, or everything is the same everywhere, with little minor variances or discrepancies between locations. By average, everything is the same no matter where you go in the hypothetical universe, and everything that occurs within has no intelligent guiding force. It is all due to chance and chaos. So anyway, triangulation on Polaris is sort of a catch-22 when you're dealing with lines of sight towards Polaris from, say, 45 degrees north, comparing that from sundown to sunup, so from dusk till dawn. And again, you would get sort of a triangle on Polaris from one observational point from dusk till dawn. Now, it's fairly well known that Polaris is useful in determining one's latitude in the northern hemisphere, as whatever Polaris's angular elevation, according to a sextant, will always determine the observer's latitude. So, like, if you see Polaris at 45 degrees above the horizon, then you are standing at the 45 degrees north latitude. If you see Polaris at 5 degrees above the horizon, then your latitude is 5 degrees north. If you take 5 minutes to map this out on a simple 2D design software, or even spend a bit of time with paper and a compass, it becomes apparent that the entire ball Earth theory has some serious problems. If you guys are enjoying this video, please consider making a contribution either through PayPal or becoming a Patreon member. I'll put links up on the screen here, www.patreon.com/themorgile or www.paypal.me/themorgile. Your support is obviously not mandatory, but it is greatly needed and appreciated, so big shout out and thanks to all of you that would like to and are able to help. Okay, so as you can see in this image, we're assuming a ball Earth and taking the well-known data of Polaris elevation angle corresponding to one's own latitude. In this example, we're assuming this line of sight towards Polaris at 5 degrees north, 45 degrees north, and 85 degrees north. Big thanks and shout out to Karen B for doing this in AutoCAD and getting way better results than I did when I did a similar 2D experiment with with Adobe. So anyway, what you'll see here is this line of sight towards Polaris, more or less parallel lines, regardless of the latitude. However, if you follow those lines out to where they can all converge upon the hypothetical axis, it's about 200,000 or a little bit less than 200,000 miles to Polaris. So that's an interesting side note, and I would urge anyone interested to do this sort of thing with AutoCAD to scale and see what you come up with, because that is pretty damning for the globe, I would say. Although, of course, they could argue refraction, it certainly does not conform to their 2.5 quadrillion miles, as you would expect, since the globe is perfect, right? And everything in the globe, hypothetically, was built without refraction in mind. So, food for thought. Now, one of the other things that you glean from this diagram is that when you consider that the Earth is supposedly in motion around the Sun, which is supposedly in motion at a 60-degree angle to that plane around the so-called galactic center, and that is also supposedly in motion, although that would not count because Polaris is allegedly part of the Milky Way galaxy. The fact that it remains fixed above the axis for all of recorded history does not jive with the chaotic Copernican globe-Earth theory. The fact that Polaris is central to all the other stars for all of history flies in the face, indeed, of the entire globe-Earth theory. If you want to know the truth, it disproves it because axial precession and all of this motion of the heavens or motion of the balls is built in inherently into the globe-Earth theory. Polaris's behavior, according to a ball-Earth theory, proves it to be a local phenomenon, as we are very much zeroed in on a local object, or relatively local object. Certainly not light years away, but apparently a couple 100,000 miles away, according to the ball-Earth theory. Of course, humoring that theory, the entire infinite universe hypothesis falls apart, and as it does not match observable reality. And looking at this other diagram here of how the ancient astronomers of the 17th and 18th centuries, and continuing to today, assume that they're able to triangulate on stars and measure their distance based on their minor degrees of parallax. And this is just absolutely preposterous, because the distance to the Sun is an assumed value that was derived by just ridiculous means. Probably won't get into that today, but it is just some more globe-tarded hypothetical nonsense where they get the distance to the Sun. And it may be covered a bit in this article that I want to read to you guys, because I think this is really important to grasp how the globe came to be hypothetically. But they say that they measure these very minute degrees of stellar parallax in order to glean the distance to specific stars. But again, those stars they assume to be closer, they measure changes in over time in terms of their relative position to other stars, very minute changes. And it begins to become just absurd, all of the assumptions that go into these calculations that you must adhere to, least of which certainly would not be the globe-Earth hypothesis, which we all know is just ridiculous. The Earth isn't a spinning globe, but many people have built their paradigm around this scientismic sort of nonsense. Okay, so reading from this article, and I'll put a link in the description. It's called The History of Astronomy, Part 11, or maybe that's Part 2. Yeah. So they say it was an age of exploration and discovery in Europe. While the sailors and merchants set off to cross the oceans and chart the globe, scientists embarked on their own exciting journey to probe the infinitely great and invisibly tiny. These investigations became possible at the turn of the 17th century with the invention of the telescope and microscope, both credited to Dutch lens makers. Shortly after the invention of the telescope, Italian astronomer Galileo Galilei built his own version and was the first to observe the sky with an enhanced eye in 1609. This inaugurated a new era in observational astronomy, and I would say hypothetical astronomy as well, and fostered the development of modern experimental science, as well as modern hypothetical alliance. The telescope allowed astronomers to gather ample evidence to test the heliocentric view of the universe that had been proposed a few decades earlier by the Polish astronomer Nicholas Copernicus. And again, that's of course where we derive the entire Copernican principle theory, which has somehow become a law of astronomy that must be adhered to in order to be taken seriously, which I'm not sure exactly how that happened, but it's a good example of how science, or rather science, hypothetical science, controls the minds and the thoughts of even supposedly objective scientists, which is beyond me, but the observations made by Galileo would open up the way for certain so-called discoveries, along with the laws of planetary motion formulated by German astronomer Johannes Kepler. Galileo's work and the foundations for the theory of universal gravitation. And this theory, developed by English physicist and mathematician Isaac Newton and published in 1687, removed or posited certain things that appeared to lend credence to the notion that the Earth revolves around the Sun. Now, this is where we get into how I found this article. I was just doing an image search for stellar parallax, but this little sectionette, it's called the parallax view. It says the availability of improved instruments and the acceptance of the heliocentric system gave astronomers renewed motivation to search for stellar parallax, a natural effect of the Earth's annual motion around the Sun, or so they assume. See, the thing is you would expect to see stellar parallax if we were in motion around the cosmos, as they claim. And so, of course, we don't see any sort of noticeable stellar parallax over the ages, as you would expect, because the greater motion is not that of the Earth around the Sun in the globe Earth hypothesis. Instead, the greater motion would be the galaxy through the cosmos and the stars around the galactic center, not necessarily the Earth around the Sun, if you're humoring this theory. And so over time you would expect to see major changes in the relative positions of the constellations, and yet part of the root of the word constellation, I think it's no surprise that it implies consistency or constancy, because constellations have never changed. And to say that these minor degrees of stellar parallax that it appears to me they invent, or they read too much into these minor discrepancies in the apparent position of the stars. First off, they assume that certain stars are closer than others by their brightness, and then they begin to derive their figures of these minor changes over time. So continuing on, parallax is an apparent movement of a foreground object with respect to its background, owing to a change in the observer's position. Astronomers thought that the Earth's orbit would provide a reasonably long baseline to detect stellar parallax and exploit these measurements to determine the distance to the stars. And of course, one big problem that I see right off the bat is they're assuming that the Earth is going around the Sun here and that this whole thing is stationary. But in fact, the Sun, from the time 6 months it takes for the Earth to hypothetically change sides of the Sun would have moved at a 60-degree path to that plane of orbit, just millions and millions of miles. It's supposedly traveling at over 500,000 miles an hour. So over 6 months, it's not even worth figuring up how preposterous it is, but they're assuming the base of a triangle when in fact you've got 2 points removed in space by millions of miles, not the base of a triangle whatsoever. Yet the stars are indeed so fixed, they can get away with this because people don't think that far into it. If point A on the left, where the Earth is hypothetically to the left of the Sun, is in the winter, and 6 months later, point B, where the Earth is the right of the Sun, is summer, say in the northern hemisphere, the sun would have moved over 2 billion miles, 2,137,440,000 miles. And so to hypothesize or to imagine that you somehow have even the base of a triangle, even hypothetically, is absurd. But it just goes to show the lengths that globetards will go to convince themselves and others of their theory. It goes on to read, astronomy was not just for fun or curiosity. The expansion of maritime navigation demanded precise maps of the sky. And that's an important point. You see, we definitely have stars and constellations in the flat Earth hypothesis, just as we have stars and constellations in the globe Earth hypothesis. However, the globe Earthers claimed that the fact that navigating by the stars works, they claim that that is exclusive to a globe. And in fact, it is not exclusive to a globe. Navigating by the stars works in either hypothesis. And so it is the globe Earth that always, as a rule, takes mutually inclusive ideas and claims it 100% exclusively for the globe. And so that's extremely disingenuous, unscientific, anti-truth. But again, it is typical for the globe Earth argument. I mean, we see it practically everywhere we look. So the problem of mapping the stars perfectly pushed governments of some European states to support and fund the first great astronomical observatories. Two major institutes, and I would say that is probably not true. I would imagine that the ancients were studying the stars with major observatories long before modern history understands people to have been, building observatories. But I digress. Two major institutes that would push forward the charting of the skies were established in the late 17th century. The Paris Observatory and the Royal Greenwich Observatory. At the Royal Greenwich Observatory in London, English astronomer John Flamsteed completed the first stellar catalogue with the aid of a telescope, published in 1725. Flamsteed's catalogue listed the positions of almost 3,000 stars with a precision of 10 to 20 arc seconds. This was a marked improvement on the one completed just 2 centuries earlier by Danish astronomer Tycho Brahe. I would just quickly mention that just because stars may very slightly change their apparent positions does not necessarily mean we can automatically attribute that to stellar parallax. And in fact, I think the minor changes or discrepancies that we see in the apparent position of stars has absolutely nothing to do with Earth's motion through space, as if that were the case, we would see long-term sweeping changes in the constellations, and yet we've never seen any such thing. So we're basically looking at minor changes in barometric pressure or atmospheric temperature for just two variables that could change the amount of refraction or aberration going on in a star. Several decades later, in 1801, the French astronomer Jerome Lalande from the Paris Observatory would publish an even greater catalogue of 50-odd stars at a precision of around 3 arc seconds. Now, again, I just want to mention that the precise mapping of the stars in no way supports a globe theory, as again, we would expect to see extreme stellar parallax over time that would completely reface the landscape of constellations on a sweeping, constant, ever slow basis, but never to be seen again. Constellations would be a fleeting, temporary thing, just as Polaris's centrality to all the other stars would have been a fleeting, temporary thing due to all of the motion that's purported, as well as the angular changes of the Earth's axis itself. Again, it is claimed that the Earth's axis goes through one slow wobble cycle every 26,000 years. And so when you break that down to 1 degree every 72 years, we should notice major changes in Polaris' centrality to the axis, especially when you consider the minuteness at which scientists are measuring apparent changes in position of stars relative to one another, and scientists assuming that is due to parallax. However, there is no evidence that the Earth has ever moved a single inch ever. Now, real quick, we're just going to talk about the moon and its phases being incompatible with the heliocentric theory, the ball Earth theory. The fact that you can see the full moon, for example, sometimes hours after sunrise, completely disagrees with the heliocentric theory. This is, of course, because the full moon should be positioned 180 degrees, or on the complete opposite side of the Earth compared to the sun. The phases of the moon give us an exact position of the moon in its orbit if we're going to assume the heliocentric ball Earth theory for argument's sake. So the no moon phase would place the moon directly aligned to the sun, although it may or may not be aligned to the sun on the ecliptic plane. It will be aligned to the sun in terms of its orbit. Now, when you have a no moon phase that is indeed aligned to the sun or is indeed aligned to the ecliptic plane during that precise moment in its phase, then you get the solar eclipse. But the fact that the moon is in its no moon phase, that is an indicator that the moon is on the same side of the Earth in its orbit as the sun, if you're humoring the heliocentric theory. And of course, either half moon would indicate that the moon is positioned either on either side of the Earth in its orbit around the sun, hypothetically. And of course, the full moon phase would necessarily position the moon on the opposite side of the Earth as the sun, if we're humoring the heliocentric theory. So, if you can imagine the moon being clear on the opposite side of the Earth as the sun, and an observer being able to see the full moon in the broad daylight, it doesn't work. And you'll have people that argue, well, you may be able to gain a line of sight towards the sun right after sunrise. I'm sorry, towards the full moon right after sunrise. The point is, many times I've personally witnessed, and anyone else can do this during certain times of the year, full moon, hours and hours and hours after sunrise. And this would even apply to a moon that is 90% full. The fact that we can see the full moon hours after sunrise debunks the heliocentric theory. Period. End of story. And of course, the same thing goes for a crescent moon, which can be observed in many hours after sunset. Now, again, we're not talking about possibly being able to get a line of sight towards the crescent moon just instantly after sunset. What we're talking about is observing the crescent moon hours and hours and hours after sunset. Such a line of sight would not be achievable on a ball Earth. Such observations debunk the theory that the Earth is a ball with the moon orbiting it. The inner solar system operates by this same principle. So specifically Venus and Mercury, and especially Mercury, being that they are allegedly on a tighter orbit around the Sun than the Earth, the fact that we can often see Venus and Mercury after sunset, 10 or 12 degrees above the horizon line, half an hour or an hour after sunset, pretty much every month, consistently throughout the year, debunks the heliocentric theory. Because, for one thing, much like the moon, Venus and Mercury, the inner solar system planets, assuming a heliocentric theory, should be going through phases. And its phase would necessarily tell us where it is in relationship to the Earth and the Sun. So when the planets, hypothetically, are closest to the Earth in their orbit at times, then they would be not lit. The light from the sun would be reflecting out and away from the Earth into space. When they are furthest from the Earth, on the opposite side of the Sun, that is when they should hypothetically be fully lit and therefore visible, although of course you're not ever going to see Venus or Mercury hypothetically during the broad daylight when they are on the opposite side of the Sun. And of course, when you have Venus or Mercury on either side of the Sun relative to the Earth, they would be approximately half lit. And these would be the only possible times that you could get a line of sight towards these objects after sunset. And I would add that the times when Venus and Mercury would hypothetically be in these positions so as to be visible after sunset would be rare. You would expect to see these alignments only rarely, and yet we can see after sunset or before sunrise Venus and Mercury very frequently. So the fact that we see consistently and not having good visibility towards Venus or Mercury is the exception to the rule. Is not good evidence. It's not aligning with what you would expect to see in a heliocentric solar system. And then, of course, you have the sheer distance to the so-called planets as millions of miles at their nearest. If you think that you can see an object that is a few thousand miles in diameter from dozens of millions of miles away, when it's being indirectly lit, no less, then I got a bridge I'd like to sell you, because apparently you'll believe anything. Angular resolution is a thing where our eyes are only capable of discerning apparent angular size of a certain degree. And once an object, regardless of how large it is, once it gains a certain distance from the observer, the angular size of the object becomes too small for our eyes to discern. And so when you get into the distances of the inner solar system planets and the alleged sizes of these things, it becomes clear that the human eye should never be able to discern such a minute angular size from the distances that they claim, especially when we're talking about indirect reflected light. So like when the planets are allegedly at their nearest, they would not be lit, and therefore you'd never see them when they're at their nearest. When they're at their furthest is when they would hypothetically be fully lit, but again, you're never going to get a line of sight towards these objects during broad daylight when they're on the opposite side of the sun. And the only times that we should technically be able to see these objects is when they're on either side of the sun relative to the Earth. And again, at that point, they would only be half lit, indirectly lit, too small to see for the distances that they claim that they are. And yet we can see Venus and Mercury practically every night, or practically every night for every month of the year. And there are certain dates that one or the other may be not easy to see or impossible to see. But again, that is the exception to the rule. When, if you're really humoring the heliocentric theory, you would expect it to be the rule that you just simply can't get a line of sight towards Venus or Mercury most of the time, and on rare occasions you would expect to be able to achieve a line of sight towards Venus or Mercury, possibly never Mercury in fact. But even when you do get those rare instances where you hypothetically can get a line of sight to them, they would be indirectly lit. And that's just, frankly, that's not what we see in reality. And so the heliocentric ball Earth theory becomes just more and more preposterous the more you look into it. And finally, the lack of Earth curvature, I think, is the biggest thing. You can't have a ball Earth without curvature to the darn thing. And since the word geometry literally etymologically translates to measure the Earth, any flat Earth video deserves a mention at least of the total absence of geological curvature, especially as measured over long stretches of standing water. at the end of the day, if we merely trust our senses and second guess some of these assumptions which were forced into our paradigm very early on, it's impossible to come to any other conclusion than the ball Earth theory is ridiculous and the Earth is clearly a motionless plane. Yet we have to answer to all of this hypothetical physics, hypothetical astrophysics, which has built empires around itself. And most people have a paradigm that is constructed around this theory, this Copernican principled universe, where everything is homogeneous, nothing is special or unique, when in fact nothing could be further from the truth. And it is plainly obvious to anyone that has gone through the steps of actually skeptically analyzing the rigid belief system that is theoretical physics. Those who claim that everything was created by random chance, chaos, there is no intelligent deciding creative force behind the universe, have faith in doctrines of men as opposed to merely listening to their common sense and trusting their senses. So with that, we're going to wrap this one up. It's been a little longer than I had shot for. So again, if you'd like to support this channel, you can do so with a one-time contribution through PayPal to www.paypal.me/themorguile, or a recurring monthly contribution through Patreon for as little as $1 a month at www.patreon.com/themorguile. Again, your participation or support is not obligational, but it is greatly needed and much appreciated. So with that, God bless you all. Spread the word, spread the world, and peace.
Make the earth shake. Make the earth shake. Rock on. Make the earth shake. Make the earth shake.